So welcome, everybody. I'm really excited to be opening the To&Through Research Spotlight. And today we're joined by Dr. Shantá Robinson and Dr. Kelly Hallberg, who'll be presenting on helping homeless students beat the odds. I think this is going to be a really exciting presentation today, especially since we'll be hearing about the experiences of homeless students in the Chicago public schools, both from a quantitative perspective and a qualitative perspective. So we're really going to be able to get a really rich understanding of what their experiences are like. Also, before we get started, I wanted to let you know about a few upcoming events from the To&Through project. So first, I guess in a couple of weeks, we have a data collaborative, and the University of Illinois at Chicago are going to be sharing about new initiatives that better support Black enrollees. On June 9th, we have a research spotlight from Kids First Chicago, who'll be sharing about the Chicago Public Schools enrollment crisis. And then finally, we'll be wrapping up June with a data collaborative from our colleagues at the Network for College Success. And they'll be presenting on a survey tool on developmental relationships. So we have a lot of really exciting events. And if you want to join us for these, May dropped in the link in chat. Okay, I also wanted to share with you one new thing that we've started to do with these research spotlights. I mean, we've been hearing how people come to these research spotlights, but really would like to have a little bit more of a chance to interact with each other, to sort of process what they heard. So we started having these optional post-event discussion times. So we'll be providing a Zoom link where you can go and join the session. It'll be a half hour, and you'll be able to join people in small groups and sort of think about what you heard. And we'll also be posing a reflection question from Shantá and Kelly to help you think about the presentation. And before we get started, I wanted to introduce our two speakers. Dr. Kelly Hallberg manages the scientific rigor and direction of the Inclusive Economy Labs projects, so here at the University of Chicago. She oversees a portfolio of applied research projects examining innovative approaches to reducing violence and improving the academic and life outcomes of urban youth. She also serves as Senior Research Associate at the University of Chicago's Harris School of Public Policy. Before joining Urban Labs, Hallberg was a principal researcher specializing in educational program evaluation and policy analysis at AIR. And then we're also joined by Dr. Shantá Robinson, who's an assistant professor in the University of Chicago Crown Family School of Social Work Policy and Practice. Her research interests include the role of social identity in marginalized students and educational experiences, aspirations and outcomes, inequities in the distribution of educational resources. While Dr. Robinson's research is framed for scholarly outlets, its purpose is to assist school members, so teachers, administrators, and community leaders in living up to the grand potential of public education, to identify, support, and make possible the capabilities and promise of every student, irrespective of the student's familial background, neighborhood, or social location. And from here, I will be turning it over to Dr. Robinson to begin our presentation.
Thank you so much, Jenny. Thank you, May. Thank you, everyone, for inviting us to present on our research here today. There we go. It is called Known, Valued, and Inspired New Evidence on Student Homelessness. And, you know, it's always tough for me to figure out where to begin with these big technical reports and how to begin to tell the story of how we came to our findings. But a good place to start is always with the stories. We start by acknowledging that our social world, including that of schools and education-based spaces, is not fixed. That, as Gloria Ladson-Billings tells us, we construct our worlds with our experiences, our words, as well as our silences. As such, it was important for us to speak directly with families and caregivers and students and school personnel to come to understanding, to get a clearer picture of how housing instability impacts the schooling experience of students and their families. And whose stories do we center? We conducted focus groups and spoke with students and families who represented over 15 CPS neighborhood schools, 6 additional Chicago charter schools or option schools for a total of 21 schools. These schools were located from the far south, throughout the west, to the far north. Our sample was diverse in nearly all demographics, including race, ethnicity, age, and gender. So what did we learn? While all the findings can be read in our report, Kelly and I will discuss some of our key findings today. So what's important? Carrie here notes that in this first quote, that opening book never paid her bills. It is critical to understand what Carrie is saying and what she's not saying. She's not saying that school is unimportant or that education isn't essential. In fact, Carrie is one of the young people who is attempting to pursue higher education. Her housing instability led her to prioritize her needs in such a way that paying her bills rose to the top. And in her community, in her family, in her spaces, she didn't see a connection between formal education and economic stability or economic mobility. Waleed here adds another component that was echoed with every single participant in the study. They are all trying. They are working through difficult home lives and living situations. And what surprisingly rose to the top time and time again is the pursuit of even more education. Finally, Kevin here gives some insight into what he thinks would help others like him succeed. More understanding, more empathy. And I'm reminded of the quote by James Baldwin that says, quote, "Youth must be the worst time in anybody's life. Everything's happening for the first time, which means that sorrow then lasts forever. Later, you can see that there was something very beautiful in it. That's because you ain't got to go through it no more," end quote. It may be easy for some to be cynical about the experiences of young people, and their plea for more empathy can be interpreted by some as their desire for lower expectations and perhaps a free pass. But for the young people in this study, they weren't asking for lowered expectations. They were asking for resources, mentorship, and guidance, and a response to their housing instability that was foregrounded by a focus on empathy. The full report provides details regarding the common themes from the focus groups. And as you can see here in this graphic, they overlap with one another in multiple complex ways. Many instances of trauma coincide with familial strife, and similarly, barriers to economic opportunity often intricately related to experiences of housing instability. I'd like to go through each one of these briefly, starting with trauma. Of the focus group participants, 28% reported experiencing sexual or physical violence as young children. I share here the story of Angelina, a young Black woman who has young children whom she describes as the most important part of her life. They were experiencing homelessness together at the time of our study. During her elementary and secondary education, she engaged with the foster care system and left high school before graduation. In her recounting, she states that she regrets not finishing high school, but also brings up that housing instability is not the sole source of difficulty in her life, but instead it is an ongoing issue that makes the challenges of her life and her desire to be a better parent that much harder. Moving over to housing instability, we discuss Lilith's story. Lilith remembers living in homeless shelters with her father throughout her childhood. The cycle of instability continued for her as she experienced homelessness and foster care involvement during her time as an adolescent, and like Angelina, is now raising young children and couch surfing. Her estrangement from her father, his eventual death, and the fire at her sister's house particularly highlighted a dwindling pool of social capital on which she can rely for support. The constancy of crisis in Lilith's life, like Angelina's, drowns out the details about how housing instability interrupts and impedes academic engagement and success. Instead, her experiences of loss are at the forefront of her story and are deeply intertwined with her long history of homelessness and housing instability. Next, we have economic barriers and Waleed's story. 10% of focus group participants over the age of 18 reported that they were currently employed. Only one of the 42 participants was employed full-time. Waleed was one of the part-time employed. He is ambitious and resourceful, having worked in some capacity since he was a child. When we spoke with Waleed, he was looking for a full-time job and staying in an emergency overnight shelter. Although he had more than a dozen workforce certifications, I'll say that again, Waleed had over a dozen workforce certifications. Him not having a permanent address impeded his journey for full-time living wage work. And finally, we have family life and Kevin's story. Smart and capable, Kevin expressed frustration that his personal circumstances created great obstacles to his academic engagement and draws a clear correlation between his personal life and his difficulty succeeding in school. He quotes, "I was always 3.8 or better GPA, always on high honor roll. So like academics for me was never an issue. It was just my behavior was always an issue, which can in turn affect your grades when you miss days, tardies, stuff that matters. I was just a young, angry kid with no father. Mother got to support 3 kids in a shelter by herself while working this dead-end job at this CNA job being a nurse. So it was just anger," end quote. It is no surprise that this data led us to put schools and schooling experiences at the center of this ecological model. Schools are powerful, influential institutions and can, with the right leadership, resources, improve the academic outcomes and life chances of young people and families dealing with homelessness and housing instability. And the stories, the voices of these young people and the parents and caregivers echo that sentiment time and time again. Even the young people who had experienced trauma at the metaphorical hands of the schooling industrial complex, they looked to that same system to save them. Education will lift them up and education will lift them out. I'm going to quickly pass over to Kelly to discuss the quantitative findings which informed our qualitative study.
Thanks, Shantá. In addition to the conversations that we had with students and their families, the Inclusive Economy Lab's really deep partnership with Chicago Public Schools has allowed us to access data on over 10 years of student records that allow us to examine the scope and scale of housing instability in the district, as well as to understand the experiences of how the experience of homelessness affects young people's ability to engage in school, and think about how we can better support these students. As far as we know, this partnership and the transparency around students experiencing housing instability is really pretty unique in the country, and we're hopeful that this will allow us to better support students. So when we dig into the data, we see that about 5% of CPS students at any given time are experiencing homelessness. So this includes both students who are literally homeless, so living in shelter, living on the street, living in a vehicle, and students who are living doubled up, living with a family or a friend as a result of economic need. This is the equivalent of there being one CPS student in every classroom who is experiencing housing instability. When we look over time, this number actually increases. So we see that over the course of their experience within Chicago Public Schools, about 13% of students will experience housing instability at one time. Another unique aspect of this partnership with CPS is that it allows us to disaggregate the data by student demographic characteristics. The Federal Department of Education, while they require districts to report out on students experiencing housing instability, do not require districts to disaggregate this by race or ethnicity, which can really obscure some of the inequities that we see. And as I'm sure is not a surprise to folks on this call, our country's history of segregation and unequal access to the means of wealth accumulation has meant that Black Chicagoans are more likely to have to access shelter, and that Black children in the city of Chicago are more likely to experience poverty when they're growing up. And sadly, we see that Chicago Public Schools is not immune to these societal patterns. Roughly a quarter of Black students will experience housing instability while enrolled in the district, and that's compared to just 2% of their white and Asian peers, and 4% of students who identify as Hispanic. And as the narratives that Shantá shared really make clear, the experience of housing instability and the traumatic experiences that really too often accompany that experience of housing instability can pose barriers to students' engagement in school. So when we look at students who are experiencing housing instability and compare them to similar stably housed peers, we see that elementary school students miss on average 3 more days of school. For high school students who are experiencing housing instability when they're unaccompanied, that is not living with a parent or guardian, this gap increases to more than 8 days a year. And in addition to these documented absences, we know that students who are experiencing housing instability, they move from school to school frequently. And so there's often enrollment gaps that lead to even more lost time in the classroom. So not surprisingly, this lost time in school can lead to decreases in academic performance. So for example, when we look at high school students who are experiencing literal homelessness, they have high school GPAs that are about a 0.5 percentage point or 0.46 points lower on a GPA scale than their similar stably housed peers. That's the difference between an A and a C in one class. Now, given the importance of students' GPA in sort of unlocking post-secondary opportunities, this gap is really notable. So we go to the next slide. Everything I've talked about so far looks at students on average who are experiencing housing instability. But when we dig in, it's really important to note that the experience of any student really varies widely. And as a result, the supports that students need likely vary as well. So when we look at students in grades 6 through 12, we see that the plurality of the students that are experiencing housing instability experience short-term doubled up housing instability. So they're living doubled up with a family or friend for a period of 1 or 2 academic years, and then the situation resolves itself and they become stably housed. There's another third of students in grades 6 through 12 who fall into a group that we characterize as experiencing late teen instability. So these are young people who have their first experience of housing instability towards the end of high school, so in their junior or senior year. And one can really imagine that both the reasons these students are experiencing housing instability and the supports that they might need might be quite different than a younger student who experiences a short time living doubled up. When we look at the remaining third of students who experience housing instability between 6th through 12th grade, they break down into 3 main groups. The first is what we call district exiters. So these are students who we see experiencing their first experience of housing instability, and then they quickly leave the Chicago Public Schools after that experience. Unfortunately, because we only see students in the CPS data, we don't know much about the outcomes of these students long-term and where they end up. One of the goals, our longer-term goals with this partnership, is to link up these data with data from the state so we can better understand the outcomes for this group of students. The next group of students, about 9.6% of students experiencing housing instability between grades 6 and 12, are also living doubled up like our first group. But for these students, that experience of living doubled up lasts much longer, 3 or more years. And then the final group of students, about 8.5% of students, are identified as homeless for a shorter period of time, so 1 or 2 academic years, but these students are primarily residing in the city's shelter system. And it's worth noting that we don't have time to dig into all of the details. You can see our longer report to do so, but we see really similar patterns when we look at younger students within CPS. In addition to having varied experiences with housing instability, the interaction between students' experiences with housing instability and their academic performance varies as well. So we do see that the majority of students who experience housing instability fall into one of two groups. Either they have below average academic performance before their first experience of housing instability, and then that lower than average academic performance persists once they experience their first experience of housing instability. So that's the red lines on the graphs that you see. Or they fall into a group that has average academic performance that then declines once they have their first experience of housing instability. So that's most students. However, there are about a quarter of students that actually see an improvement in academic performance following their first year that they're identified as homeless. And this, may seem a little counterintuitive at first, but we think that there might be a couple different potential explanations for this pattern. It could be that these students have been identified as homeless and as a result are receiving increased support services from their schools that could be leading to this increased academic performance. Another potential explanation, if we think back to some of the narratives that Shantá shared with us at the beginning, it could be that some of the traumatic experiences that precipitate housing instability could actually be lessened by a move to shelter or a shared housing unit, which results in the improved academic performance that we see. Nonetheless, all of these data really suggest a need to better understand the diverse needs of students and find ways to support them. And to that end, we use data to identify schools where students experience housing instability were performing better than homeless students across the district. And then we dug in and we had conversations with principals and educators in those buildings to try to understand how they're working with homeless students and what supports they think would be beneficial district-wide. And I'm going to turn it back to Shantá to share some of the insights that were gleaned from that conversation.
Thank you, Kelly. So what we learned in the study is that a lot of schools are already doing a lot to help their students. They are being creative and compassionate to address the various unique needs of their students who are living in temporary housing situations. And an analysis of the academic data identified 30 elementary and high schools where students experiencing homelessness were achieving better than expected academic results. And that is where students experiencing homelessness were, quote unquote, beating the odds. And these are the top strategies already in use by many of those CPS principals and administrators. The first is to destigmatize the homelessness status. No student should have to feel the tag of homelessness or experience shame as a result of their living situation. In practice, this meant that schools must go above and beyond to fill any gaps in resources between unstably housed students and their stably housed peers. Principals also emphasized the importance of being discreet about providing those supports. The next is to get to know kids' stories. Principals spoke about systematic ways for each student to develop a trusting one-on-one mentorship relationship with at least one adult in the building, whether it was the security guard, the lunch server, their favorite teacher, or the homelessness liaison. Students were typically asked to choose their adult advocate or vice versa, rather than assigning them, as it was important for there to be genuine affinity and authentic connection at the center of the relationship. Next is to closely and consistently monitor students. When discussing the importance of regular check-ins and ensuring, quote, multiple positive points of contact with an adult every day, end quote, one principal explained, quote, we are these students' everything and we're home, because we are the only thing that is consistent and reliable in their lives, end quote. Therefore, it is incumbent on the staff to know what is going on and be responsive to their needs. This consistency is what will keep students coming back when everything else in their lives is in flux. Next, we have sweat the small stuff, meet basic needs. One school provided food to students on Saturdays if they were food secure at home. Another school provided monthly packets of basic necessities to students, but more importantly, school personnel used these exchanges as an opportunity to get to know kids' stories and ask them what else they needed. The schools went to great lengths, including outreach to service agencies, getting donations, or fundraising among alumni to get students everything they needed. Next is to connect students and parents to opportunities to earn income. 7 of the 9 high school principals we interviewed led career or vocational high schools, which is a disproportionately high percentage of the schools compared to the 40% of high schools across the city with this distinction. These principals spoke to the positive effects of connecting students to sources of income, both as a motivator to continue in school and as an opportunity for them to contribute to their family's finances. In one school, a partnership with local city colleges enables students to receive a forklift certification as early as their sophomore year that offers them the opportunity to earn $20 an hour as part of a paid job. When elementary school principals were asked to name barriers to their students' academic engagement, many spoke about connecting homeless parents with economic opportunities. Said one principal, quote, "We need partnerships with jobs and work resources for adults. No child can be a happy child while their parent is not in a good place," end quote. Make the school a lighthouse to the community. Schools are more than educational institutions. They are community institutions. Principals emphasize that schools should be a one-stop shop for students' needs. Several schools had in-school partnerships with programs like youth engagement and mental health programs to help students manage socio-behavioral issues and the trauma associated with homelessness and housing instability. Finally, identify the right point person. Time and time again, principals highlighted the importance of identifying and appointing an engaged, sensitive staff member to act as the school's student homelessness point person or liaison. So you see, all these strategies align with at least one or more of our qualitative focus group findings and our overall ecological model.
Great. And the findings, the report that Shantá and I have been alluding to is available on the Inclusive Economy Lab website. The report came out about a year ago, last summer, and it's finally starting to feel like summer here in Chicago again. But the work continues. So the Inclusive Economy Lab continues to partner with Chicago Public Schools to think about how to best support these students. And I just wanted to highlight, before we turn it over to you all for questions, a couple areas in which the district is working to support these students, and we're working with them to learn from this. So the first is the introduction of the STLS advocates. STLS is Students in Temporary Living Situations, the acronym for students experiencing housing instability in the district. In schools that have 75 or more students experiencing housing instability, there are now full-time staff members who are working to support these students. And we've been working with CPS to understand this new role and how it's working to support students. Relatedly, there's a new pilot program that the district has launched with Facing Forward called Home Connections, which is offering housing-focused case management to CPS families that are experiencing housing instability. This provides both connection to housing resources, but also connection to other resources that the families may need to move towards housing stability. And then a final sort of effort that I would highlight is the Chicago Families Forward Fund. So with some of the recovery funds from the federal government, the district offered a one-time $500 micro grant to about 18,000 families who were without stable housing. And we have been partnering with the district to sort of understand who received these dollars and what kind of a difference they made in families' lives. So sort of more to come as we continue to work with the district. And I think we'll just leave you with a quote from a CPS principal in one of our Beating the Odds schools who inspired the title of our report. So this principal said, "I want my homeless kids to feel known, valued, and inspired, just like all kids." And I think that is really the goal and the inspiration of the work that we do. And really welcome your questions as we think about what the next phase of this work might be. So thank you.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Kelly and Shantá, for your presentation and just being able to give us like this really rich picture, both quantitatively and qualitatively, about students experiencing homelessness in CPS. So I do encourage everybody to drop questions in the Q&A box, but we do have a few already here, so I will kick us off with those. So the first question sort of references the fact that you mentioned diversity of demographics. And the question is about, the person is curious if the research looks specifically at the lens or experiences of LGBTQ plus students and young people as a demographic group, given the fact that there is some research about how LGBTQ youth, particularly trans youth, are more likely to experience homelessness. And if so, what were some of your findings or noticings that you had from that?
Yeah, from the quantitative perspective, we're a little bit limited in what we can examine because the district doesn't systematically collect data on LGBTQ plus status. And so we weren't able to do the kinds of analyses that we were able to do by race ethnicity. But I don't know, Shantá, if some of these themes have come up in the focus groups, and I know perhaps in other work that you've.
Yes, absolutely. So there was a disproportionate amount, which is sort of shown in all data across the country, that folks who are LGBTQ plus AI are disproportionately experiencing homelessness or housing instability. And that was shown in our focus groups as well with these young people. They were disproportionately on the queer spectrum, and they were disproportionately Black, right? But surprisingly, the experiences they were having, particularly with their involvement and engagement with school spaces, was similar to any other student who was experiencing housing instability. It's almost like if you think about social identity making and you think about queer identity as a social identity making, homelessness also became one of those sort of interesting identity making markers. And it connected these young people, and they had similar experiences, not because of their social identity around queerness or around race, but around this issue of housing instability and how that sort of made more sense for them, and how they were moving throughout the world at this given time during their adolescence, and how they created engagement with their peers, and how they saw their futures and their aspirations, which became interesting. And their queerness or their other social identities may have created the space for extra trauma around bullying in school, or created the space for trauma around their housing instability in the first place, right? Being kicked out of their home, or other things like that. But the experiences with school itself and this enduring folk norm they had about how they would eventually see stability or success was remarkably the same. Hope that makes sense to the question asker.
Great, thank you. So we also have, actually, I'm going to actually be combining a couple of questions. So one is just about how you looked, how the data might be broken down by neighborhoods or by schools. So, by the communities where students live or the schools that they attend. And then also thinking about like how the strategies that are used to support homeless students in option schools differ from those done in neighborhood schools. How are their experiences different by like school type? And then also like, what do you feel like some of the lessons learned that could, where like option schools could learn from neighborhood schools or vice versa?
Yeah, I can start. So we absolutely can break down by neighborhood, and other schools we have not broken the quantitative findings down. So unfortunately, that's not something that I can speak to too much. We do know, I sort of started us off by saying on average, there's one student experiencing housing instability in each classroom in CPS, but absolutely those students are not evenly distributed across the district. And so there are schools where housing unstable students make up a substantial share of the student population. And so, the supports that students need in those schools are very different than if you have one or two families experiencing housing instability. Yeah. And I guess the only, in terms of like things that the different school types can learn from one another, I mean, one theme that Shantá spoke to in her discussion of the Beating the Odds findings that stands out to me as a sort of idea of the school being the lighthouse and bringing in community services to the school building. And we saw that sort of across school types. So it wasn't the case that like every single, like there were option schools that we talked to, there were neighborhood schools, but you do see these practices that support students that kind of translate across school type boundaries. And so I do think like the strategies generally are not unique to one type of CPS school, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I'll just add one thing in terms of, interesting that the vocational schools or the schools that, what did I call them? Career or vocational schools. One thing they also understand is that money matters for young people and their families, and that finances matter for a lot of people, particularly in Chicago. And sometimes teachers who particularly have gone through a linear path to get to where they are, you go to high school, you do well, you go to college, you do well, you come out, that sort of linear path creates this space where we often say, this is the path everyone should take. And what these other schools have not noticed is that there's no shame also in wanting to make money and helping to support your family, even at 15, 16, 17 years old. And if you center that on what the students need, and you somehow match that with what their eventual career aspirations could be, you could create a win-win for these young people where they don't have to choose their own financial stability and mobility and their families' survival from day to day, that you can combine that, and that could be done with the educational resources that we have at hand. So that's what I would like to see neighborhood schools sort of tap into more, and they can learn that from the career and vocational spaces.
Yeah, there's also a question, asking like if which schools have especially high percentage of STLS students and are especially successful with the strategies to help those students. And then I think most importantly, like, are there characteristics of those schools that make them more effective in their work with these students? So, I mean, I think you're mentioning the career component of it, but are there other types of schools or characteristics in terms of like school staff or anything like that that seem to make a difference?
Oh, thanks, Kelly. You saw me unmute myself, right? That's the new age cue of I'm ready to talk. We used to raise our hands. We don't do that anymore. I don't know. One of the things I noticed with the qualitative focus groups is that young people who were in these schools that were really supportive were also non-punitive when it came to the social behaviors, right? You're tardy 3 times, which means you get a more punitive consequence for your tardiness. They were flexible around their expectations of timeliness. They were flexible around their expectations of how students completed their work and when, and they gave them extra resources to do that. So everything was compassionate led, and they sought to understand before they sought to punish. And young people talked about that and why they were very engaged and connected to those schooling spaces.
And the only thing I would add is it seems like the practices in the schools are really what was the commonality rather than school type or structure. So there are like a variety of schools that have, very different structures from like a district perspective, but it was really this like knowing students' stories, understanding where they are, meeting the students where they're at, that, some of the schools were very large and had a, large number of students that they were serving. Some were much, much smaller and could give much more individualized supports. But the commonality was less the characteristic of the school itself, but sort of how they approach supporting these students that you saw the commonalities across setting.
Excellent, great. So Shantá, you had mentioned that there's some schools that had like the resources to go above and beyond to like fill the gaps that were needed by homeless students and their peers. So I think the questions are like, where are schools able to find these resources? Are they leaning on like staff-led fundraising, community organizations, other agencies? I think you mentioned a couple of things, but just to hear how this worked, I think would be really useful. Also, probably useful for schools to be thinking about.
Absolutely. I think in part to our findings in our work, the district is starting to creating more lines for resources for these schools and creating more space for these schools to get the resources to meet the unique needs of their STLS population. But schools are also going above and beyond by holding fundraisers where that money goes particularly into helping these young people, seeking donations from local organizations. Is a big one that principals talked about very much, and getting their PTOs involved in at least acknowledging that the space has students who are in need and the need looks different than what they're accustomed to or what they're used to seeing, right? So a part of it is this thing of breaking down that youth homelessness exists, right? That for a lot of people, we don't understand that young people are unaccompanied in these ways. And we've only got this concept of what homelessness is like from Hollywood movies, the Lifetime movie of Homeless to Harvard, right? So getting staff and getting PTO and community members to understand there is a problem and that these young people are a part of our school community. And as such, we need to start investing in what resources they need that are unique to the other student body. And principals are being really creative about how to do that. And now the district is starting to be really creative about how to meet those needs as well.
Great. So we also have, Shantá, I guess kind of a question that's kind of probably somewhat directed at you. It's like, so one of the students that you interviewed, Waleed, had over a dozen certifications. And so given that, like, what lessons can other post-secondary institutions, particularly those that are granting certificates, take away from this? Like, because it sounds like something that would be useful, like, across the country. And I think it's good to also recognize work that CCC has been doing in this area too.
Absolutely. It's the connection, right? That we have workforce development and these certifications that are connected to the skills you need, but not to the employers that you need to hire these folks, right? There has to be a seamless connection, and these employers have to be willing to take on these young people, knowing that certain things will not be there. Permanent address may not be there for a while, right? That living wage means something really important to these young people. Benefits mean something really important to these young people, right? And so the workforce certifications are great in theory, but in practice, if it's not connected to a job at the very end, you're collecting certifications, hoping that at some point your entrepreneurship is going to kick in, right? That you're going to go out and get that job and that certification will be in your back pocket. But what we found with Waleed is that he kept doing that, trying to figure out what job was going to hit, right? It's almost like people who go to different gas stations to play the lottery, trying to figure out which gas station is going to be their one. And they sort of figure in their mind, at some point, they're going to hit that gas station that's going to be the right ticket. Waleed was doing the same thing with his workforce certifications. And the certifications were usually free to get, and yet the employment never worked out on the other end. So he was highly educated and yet couldn't find one full-time job that would give him a living wage and benefits to be able to take care of himself. So I would recommend that workforce development programs also have this deep and abiding connection with the employers so that young people aren't left sort of fending for themselves once it's time to leave the program and go into the workforce.
Yeah, I'm going to take my own prerogative and ask my own question related to that. Because like, as you're talking about that, I mean, it sounds like there's also like a lack of awareness or empathy on the part of employers where they've set up these requirements, like you need to have a permanent address, you need to have all these things in order to get a job. I mean, are there programs or employers that you know, like nationally even, that are doing a better job, or is there any kind of growing awareness of that there are people who are actually, you know, highly qualified, especially in an economy where, you know, there's people talk about a worker shortage. It seems like this would be, you know, a good time to be figuring this out.
Right. This is where me and the young people differ, right? So they have a lot of hope and optimism, and I'm so cynical. I'm cynical in a lot of ways because I think what's happening is that employers sort of want it both ways. They want this deep pool of people who are qualified and skillful, and they want to be able to not pay them well once they get them. And they want to be able to create these obstacles and challenges to get a diverse pool of people into their workforce, right? So if we say we have to have a permanent address and that there's nothing we can do about that, that's going to limit some of these young people who are really trying to get on their feet. And we say, you know, you can't get a great paying job until you get a permanent address, but you can't get a permanent address until you get a great paying job, which leaves these young people in this continuous cycle. And then we blame them when they're 25, 26, 27, when that cycle has continued. And now they're young adults or emerged adults who are now dealing with homelessness and housing instability. And the cycle that was started with their parents continues. And we often say, well, these young people weren't motivated. They didn't have the will, the drive to pull themselves up by their bootstraps. But you look at Waleed, he has 12 certifications. He's trying every day to do this. And he's cobbled together jobs that together don't allow him to get a permanent address. And what happens when we do that? What happens when we tell young people, you have to have a birth certificate and a social security card to get this job? And they say, well, I don't have either, because maybe I was kicked out when I was 14, or the house fire that my cousin went through, all my documents were in their house, and now I'm just out here because I don't know how to navigate this complex bureaucratic system that says I have to have these documents to prove that I'm worthy of getting a permanent full-time job that pays a living wage. We've sort of set up these groups in this system to always be at the bottom, struggling to climb. And again, that's the cynic in me. The optimist in me, which doesn't come out very often, says that there are movements in different fields to sort of change this. If you look at the food industry of Chicago, right, the restaurant industry, the hospitality industry, that's a growing industry for young people who are dealing with housing instability. The only downside is it's also one of the most stressful and highly physical jobs you can also manage and be in, right? So those jobs are more willing to be open to young folks dealing with their housing instability and be supportive. They pay a living wage, and you're also going to be on your feet for 14 hours a day, right? So there are some spaces of hope, and they just come with different positives and negatives.
Definitely, thank you. Thank you for indulging my questions. I mean, part of it too is I just like the employment side of things, or the labor market and homelessness are really go hand in hand with a lot of these things, and to like separate them out, I feel like that's not necessarily being done sufficiently. So I really, even with your cynical answers a bit there too, I think it's also realistic. So we also have a couple of questions about the STLS liaisons. So I guess I'll just start off with kind of like a pretty straightforward question, but can you sort of describe a little bit about the type of training that those liaisons receive?
Yeah, so there are STLS liaisons in every school, and they usually play another role in the school and then also support STLS students. And then now this new role in some of the schools of STLS advocate is a full-time role for schools that have sort of a high number of families. And the district does do training for folks in both roles that's focused around how do you identify families, how do you engage them in services. They're provided some training around referrals that they can make to support services. I think especially for the liaisons though, because this is only a part of their role, there can be a limit in how much training they can be required to attend and how much time they have for this role. So I think that is a tension. We were lucky enough to be able to share some of the findings from this work with liaisons a couple summers ago when we were starting to generate these findings. So we were able to plug into some of their trainings, but this mostly focused around identification, the McKinney-Vento Act, which is sort of how the resources that families are entitled to, and then like connecting them with other support services.
Great, so that's super helpful. So I guess there's also a question about like what kind of positions did the STLS liaisons typically have? I mean, are they counselors or teachers? And then were there any kind of particular characteristics that schools felt that really made their STLS liaisons successful?
Mm-hmm. So to the first question, they play every role. So and like there actually wasn't a strong correlation between like your official title and whether they were a great person for this role. So there are teachers, there are administrators, there are office workers who all take on the role of STLS liaison. I think it was more of like a dispositional piece of a calling to do the work well, an openness to families, someone that the families felt comfortable talking to, and revealing the things that they were struggling with. Like those were the things that were more predictive of someone being a really strong liaison than having, you know, the title of X, Y, and Z teacher or counselor. I don't know, Shantá, is there anything you would add?
I was surprised by having a front office staff for STLS liaisons. That I anticipated a lot of coaches or a lot of the most popular teachers in the school, but those front office staff were critical because they were usually the first people that a person sees when they walk into a school.
Yeah.
And usually they set the tone and the culture of the space. And when those people were really engaging and compassionate and offered a welcoming space for those families, they were able to get a lot more families to talk about their housing situation, even when they weren't homeless yet, but were on the verge of having some housing instability. Those front office workers knew all of the information. So I think we need to also tap into those informal spaces a lot more.
Mm-hmm. And it's sort of a naturally destigmatizing way because everybody goes in and talks to the office person. So it's not, you're not raising your hand and saying, I need X, Y, or Z support. It's like, well, I'm a parent and I'm coming into the office to talk to the woman who's at the front desk. And so it sort of reinforces that effort to destigmatize the status.
Right. And I'm not going to talk about it with the math teacher because I'm hoping the math teacher doesn't penalize my child or see my child differently than any other student sitting in the classroom, right? Yeah. That office worker has the capacity to sort of see the whole child and the whole family in a very different way, at least from a familial or guardian standpoint.
Mm-hmm.
Great, thanks. I think we have time probably for like one more question. So the last question is about among the students who you interviewed, how did the services from nonprofit organizations external to the schools connect or not connect with the services that students were receiving by the school? Did you get a sense that students felt like, oh, there's coordination across this or not? And how did that impact them?
Yeah, little to no coordination that the young people were seeing. The organizations that were external to the school spaces really focused on basic needs, really focused in on feeding young people, making sure they were safe, particularly overnight, trying to create a space where they could come and get their if, you know, if young people are reaching an age where they can be emancipated, if young people are reaching an age where they can get SSI benefits on their own, helping them manage those spaces and sort of helping them in the civic discourse, right? In the civics classes, you sort of learn how to be a citizen of the world and leave your space as you emerge into adulthood. And these nonprofit spaces, these community organizations serve that sort of civic capacity for these young people, right? And I don't think the students necessarily saw the connection of what was happening in the schools in the same way, because the schools were firmly in that space of our job is to educate you so that you can go to college or that you can get a good paying job and leave. That's sort of it, right? And these other organizations were more holistically looking at the young person and truthfully could spend a lot more time understanding their story and talking to them about where they want to go and how that nonprofit or how that organization based on this mission can help them get there. And one of the key things is that these organizations focus on housing. And what do these young people need? Very direly, they needed stable, safe housing. And schools haven't in the past been a space to do that. That's been a purview of the social service realm. That's been a purview of where teachers and administrators can say, we can't help young people be housed. That's not what we do in school spaces. And now in 2022, we're starting to see a difference in how people are talking about that we can't educate children without educating the whole child. We can't reach students' minds without knowing and playing some role into whether they're safe or not, whether they feel safe. And so that culture of how do we do that in the school is starting to filter out to how do we make sure these young people have safe spaces? How do we connect the family to the school? So that's changing within the district, which I think is wonderful. And then I think we're going to see a better connection between the nonprofit world and the school spaces of alignment. And that will be really wonderful to see. But young people didn't see it. They saw it as two very different institutions.
Well, thanks. That's helpful. It's actually good to kind of end on a hopeful note where you feel like the district is moving in the right direction to be supporting these students and also to connect and learning from the social service organizations around them. So, well, Kelly and Shantá, thank you so much for joining us today. This was really wonderful, and I really feel like, you know, really informative and really good to kind of hear about where things are headed in CPS. For homeless students. So I really appreciate you, and thank you to everybody in our audience also for joining us today. I do want to remind people that we do have our follow-up 30-minute session immediately following this. So we'll drop in a Zoom link to that. So we'll have a chance to, I don't know, sort of, I don't know, mull over what we heard, process a little bit. And then there's also a discussion question that we can all be thinking about in our small groups. So thank you, everybody, and particularly Kelly and Shantá. And I hope everybody gets a chance to enjoy our early tastes of summer today. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.